Welcome back to the Politics with Paul podcast, your home for nonpartisan discussion of political science and civics. I'm your host, Paul Rader. As you can see, we have another guest, and for those, I always start off with a disclaimer that I do not take a stance for or against political views or groups they support. But that isn't a concern this episode, because today we are talking about pluralism. A bit more specifically, how do we best promote pluralism in American politics? Our civic life is meant to be a blend of varied cultures, backgrounds, and viewpoints, coming together to improve our politics and make us more well-informed about what others think and feel. Yet in far too many cases, we see divisiveness and enmity that have threatened that ultimate thread of pluralistic unity. So how do we get back to promoting pluralism? What exactly does that look like? What are some of the biggest challenges to pluralism? These questions and more are what today's guest, Liz Vogel, is here to talk about today. Liz is the co-executive director of New Pluralists, which describes itself as a funder collaborative investing in a growing ecosystem of people, organizations, and ideas working to bring pluralism to life in communities across the U.S. She also used to be its leader of philanthropic engagement. And before that, Liz was the founder and principal philanthropy advisor of Liz Vogel Consulting and the Southern California executive director of Facing History and Ourselves. So let's talk a bit more about her work with pluralism and with New Pluralists, as well as how to best preserve and bolster pluralism in America as a whole. Please welcome Liz Vogel to the show. Thanks for coming on, Liz. How are you?
I'm doing great. Thanks so much for inviting me. Happy to be here.
Absolutely. Thank you for being here. So I always like to start off by getting to the genesis of why my guests do what they do, about our very topic. So how did you first get involved in pluralism in general before getting to New Pluralists? And then how did you become part of New Pluralists?
Great. Thanks. My career and in some ways my life has been animated by seeking to understand why we as humans tend to create sort of an other, right? We and they, us versus them. And ultimately, like my work has been like with the aim to create a bigger we. So that's really the exploration that sits at the heart of Facing History and Ourselves, the organization you mentioned, where I worked for over 2 decades as an educational organization that uses lessons from history to challenge teachers and their students to stand up to bigotry and hate. So that is, my background. And despite sort of decades of working in that space, I found myself becoming more susceptible and falling into that zero-sum trap of like we versus they, right? If they aren't with us, then they must be against us. And what that meant in practical terms for me was that I found myself distancing myself from people that I had known my whole life, that I had grown up with, like the place, where I was raised to, which is very different from where I live now. And just my own sort of sense of intolerance in a way around some things like political views, but, sort of spilling over into other aspects of life. And my own hardening lines is in many ways what brought me to this work and why I was drawn to the work of pluralism more generally. And then when I found New Pluralists, I wanted to be able to bring the skills that I had built in my career into this work.
I think that's something maybe not to the same extent, but a lot of people, if not everybody, should be able to relate to it in some way. Because part of my work that I try to stress is that anybody can be susceptible to polarization. A lot of people think of it as just party or ideology, but in the affect of polarization, the feelings that we have about people, that's where anybody can be tripped up. And I never got quite to the point where I cut off people that had different political views than me, but I definitely got into dumb Facebook arguments or got very angry about people I didn't know. And it's a very tempting trap to fall into, that zero-sum game, just like you were talking about. And so let's go ahead and get into more of this work of New Pluralists. So I mentioned in the intro a brief description of what New Pluralists is, but let's obviously now hear it from somebody who's actually part of the organization. So what is New Pluralists exactly about, and what are some of the ways it tries to achieve its goals?
Great. Thanks for that. And yes, I could have said when you were talking about Facebook fights that like unfriending, has this like pull of something like a moment of powerful something. But over time, sort of realizing that I had, unfriended my way out of relationships that mattered was kind of like that was a wake up moment. So yes, just to tie that knot there. New Pluralists. Okay, New Pluralists is a funder collaborative, and for folks who are not maybe in philanthropy, what that means is a group of foundations, that philanthropic foundations that have decided to pool their funds together to provide grants to organizations that are doing work on the ground in communities across the US. So we, as New Pluralists, take in funding from a number of foundations and then together re-grant that funding out to community work. So since New Pluralists was started in 2021, we have made grants totaling about $33 million to about 100 grantees. So in terms of what the work is, pluralism work is often sort of shorthanded as like bridge building dialogue work, which is definitely a part of the work that we have funded. However, we have also mapped out about 11 or 12 different fields of work that bring pluralism to life. So, for example, even my previous organization, a civic education organization, we never used the word pluralism there. And yet, clearly, like the work that the organization and other civic ed groups are doing contributes to a culture and the sense of pluralism in this country. So things like civic education, a lot of work in immigration or sort of welcoming work. It's a different field of practice. A lot of traditional democracy building work is part of pluralism. Some narrative or storytelling work, like the stories we tell ourselves about ourselves and who belongs. And then infrastructure work, like the spaces and places that enable us as Americans to connect with one another, to solve problems together. Like this is all part of what we know as pluralism work and fund. And then we also at New Pluralists are attending to not only work on the ground, although that is the primary way that we have made grants, but also to research. Everyone wants to know like what works to help people build stronger ties across difference. And so we have funded a ton of research as well.
Nice. I think you touched on something that is something I try to stress to a lot of people too. Is this the people who work in the pluralist and civic health and civic education space? It's not disorganized, but there isn't as much cohesiveness, not as much of a structure to it. It's a little bit disconnected from each other. Whereas the groups that are very polarized, that are purposely trying to divide people because it benefits them specifically. Ironically, the ones that are more isolated have the more robust structure and connection and cohesiveness. And I think that's really great that you guys that's a really core part of what you do, having to be involved with a lot of these groups. Now, obviously, don't want to just control what all these other groups do, but you still want to have that sense of unity, that sense of cohesion. And you were just talking about civic education and not using the word pluralism with one of your previous organizations. And another place I think that's a good segue into is that the word pluralism isn't exactly used, but it's very relevant to civic education. Is a lot of times when we talk about pluralism, it's talked about similarly to the concept that James Madison had described back in Federalist Paper number 10. This idea of a whole bunch of competing interests duking it out and no single one of them able to overpower everyone else because there's just going to be too many disparate interests. But what is pluralism about to you? Is it that competitive aspect, or is that competitive aspect of particular importance to you? Is it just the simple collaborative aspect of it? What exactly is pluralism about to you?
Love this question. Thank you. So, I define, or we at New Pluralists define pluralism as both a worldview and a practice. And so, as a worldview, pluralism is the belief that we are better together, It's the belief that the coexistence of different opinions, worldviews, ways of life, value systems actually enriches all members of our society, and that all people deserve respect and a sense of belonging. That's pluralism as a worldview. As a practice, pluralism is like the way that we actually engage with the diversity that we encounter in our lives. Like diversity is a fact of our lives. We live in a society that has, people from different walks of life, different backgrounds, different belief systems. So how do we work across our differences, such as religion, gender, race, political ideology, sexual orientation, socioeconomic status, right? All of those sort of identifiers and or just like differences, rural and urban, all of the ways that we encounter difference, how we do that, how we navigate is the practice of pluralism. So put together, I often say that pluralism is how we want to be together and how we work across difference to get stuff done.
Kind of, I see some parallels in something I learned from grad school, my political campaigning program,
Mm,
which one of the big things that from the more practical side of the program was about campaign strategy versus campaign tactics. Basically, campaign strategy basically being sort of more of the theory, like you were talking about, sort the philosophy, what your campaign is about, and then you have the tactics, which are a lot more like the practice you were talking about, how you exactly achieve those strategies. So I think that's a very good, efficient way to really think about that, because obviously the theory is all well and good to have, and it's nice to have these ideals that you're striving for, but if you don't have a practical way to get to it, the theory doesn't matter as much. So I can definitely respect and appreciate that. So talking about these more practical ways of making pluralism happen or improving pluralism, what would you say are, let's say, 2 to 3 key pieces that are necessary to having a truly pluralistic system, whether that's for the government or for some sort of program or initiative?
sure. Great question. So we can get practical right away. And I would start with the first key piece being dignity as a non negotiable, right? So, systems, initiative, program, whatever it is that's aiming to be pluralistic must uphold the inherent dignity of all people and aim to create genuine experience of belonging, right? Where it's aspirational often in our society, but um, that means that intention and that real impact has to be baseline. Number one. A second key piece are to get even more practical, like shared problem solving mechanisms. So I think the idea that to ground the pluralism from being just an idea, we need structures and initiatives that um, allow people to address like their real challenges in their real lives and communities, right? And so giving people both individual and collective agency to shape solutions that matter to their lives, like having structures and ways in place to make that possible is a key piece of demonstrating the power of pluralism and being pluralistic. And then I would also say um, the sort of what we call again relational infrastructure. So creating spaces and opportunities for meaningful connection across differences. So how do people in communities actually connect and see one another as neighbors, right? We've lost a lot of those spaces and ways that people have done that. A lot has become privatized. We're more individualistic. We're more isolated and more segregated. So but we see really powerfully how, like, where's the town square? Sometimes it exists in like faith communities, are places where people are coming together across particular kinds of differences, even as they have something that they're holding in common. Um, we're online, we're technically more connected than ever in history, but also that we have like millions of micro spaces online, it doesn't actually mean, right, that people are connecting across. So I think like that kind of infrastructure connected with or combined with like the structures for actual shared decision making with that foundation of dignity for all people are like the three beats I would hit as being like the key things. And then I'll add a fourth, which you actually referred to just a few minutes ago, which is like the infrastructure of the ecosystem of, the people who are sort of making all of those things happen, the sort of behind the scenes tools and shared measurement and just coordination. As you said, like these fields of work can feel very disconnected, and we're not aiming to impose like an agenda or sort of direct it all, but more coordination to be able to build on momentum, to be able to share knowledge, to be able to help, you know, improve and grow the kind of work that we're talking about. That critical infrastructure, which is a role that New Pluralist plays, I think is the another like key piece to having this move beyond little pockets of success in communities to something that's more widely felt and experienced in our country.
Interesting. A couple of the points that you really hit on that, I mean, obviously, I really find all those points intriguing, but there were a couple of points that really stuck out to me. Going to the very back of your answer was that that dignity is not negotiable, and I think that's fantastic. But at the same time, I think part of the whole issue for a lot of these very polarized people, whether it's by party or by ideology or issue, is that they feel that their dignity has been completely challenged by the other side, and so they think it's okay to challenge the other's dignity, and it just kind of goes back and forth. And we can have all these different opinions about various issues, like whether it's LGBT stuff or transgender participants in sports or guns or abortion or any policy you bring up. It's one thing to have a certain opinion, but you need to respect everybody else as a human being, whether regardless of what your opinion is. And unfortunately, that has been lost, especially when you talk about how some of these issues that people just automatically assume you're challenging somebody's dignity or their identity. And obviously that's something we need to strive to overcome. And then another point that you talked about was the individual versus the collaborative, and I think that's something that needs to be talked about a little bit more.
Mhm.
Is the whole, obviously, or both things are important, but sometimes, like over here in America, sometimes we hew too much to the individual and we don't think enough about what is actually benefiting all of society, or more of our individual groups, but we're not looking at the overall community. But then you have some other countries where the individual is basically not even considered, and personal thoughts and feelings might not be considered, but it's all about the community. You really need that right balance to be struck. At least that's the way I see it. So what are 2 to 3 places or programs that you would point to as prime examples of how pluralism should work, whether or not they are initiatives that New Pluralists have been directly involved in?
Great question. I'll give maybe an example or two of each. I mean, so I live in Los Angeles, and at the beginning of 2025, we experienced catastrophic wildfires, and communities across the country have been experiencing catastrophic weather events, for a very long time. That is not new information, but just speaking from experience here, the mutual aid effort that followed, right? Sort of wherever and whenever disaster happens, um, it's really amazing to see who helps out, right? How neighbors jump in, how people put aside lots of different kinds of differences and really come together. And to it's really like there's there are people are establishing invisible infrastructure, right? And rising above and rising to the challenge of seeing needs that need to be met and meeting them. And I think like outside of the formal or professional sector of like just defining and describing what that work is, like just seeing how people know how to do that and do it everywhere, or that to me is a prime example of how pluralism should work. Um, I think you can look at, if we want to go back in time and look at like major pieces of legislation or really critical, sort of movement moments in our country. For example, like the Voting Rights Act of 1965, or we could name sort of many that required really broad coalition to get passed, right? Um, it's not necessarily what we learn about as much or what we emphasize in the accomplishment of the thing, but like the work that it took, not just even politically, but across communities and different constituencies to figure out how to advance any one of those kinds of advancements in our country, requires pluralism and is sort of an example of pluralism. In terms of one of our grantees, actually, um, we have been so fortunate to partner with a group called Future Caucus. They support the next generation of bipartisan elected leaders through training and networking and coalition building. They're helping young legislators govern effectively and collaboratively. They help them identify by their generation and by their common interests sort of first. And then together, they figure out in the structure within which they're working, the partisan structure, where can they work together? What bills can they put forward? What work could they advance? And I think that's one kind of organization that we have supported, that I think shows pluralism working in action, even in a pretty tough environment sometimes to do that. And then my last example, which is not sort of politics related, but we've seen a lot of pluralism work in sort of transforming conflict and or sort of repairing after harm in a community. And so we have a partner, Resetting the Table, that really helps communities move from harm to healing, by bringing groups together, to address really like local trauma or violence, like the fractured relationships that can pull communities apart. And they have a pretty amazing track record of helping communities transform conflict into opportunities for greater understanding and collective action that really then can like lay the groundwork for stronger communities moving forward. So those are examples. Sorry, they were a little bit all over the place of um, what pluralism looks like in informal or, sort of everyday life, all the way up to sort of some big moments, in our country's history, to kind of like what it looks like on the ground today.
I actually think that's really neat that you took such a wide breadth of different organizations when it comes to pluralism, and you basically highlighted it, maybe not directly saying it, but you more or less indicated it with your answer. And this is something that we often, and I'm going to include myself in this, we often forget that pluralism doesn't necessarily have to be something inherently political. You were just talking about the last one with trying to work in against what fractures communities, or your very first example with the mutual aid. None of those have to be specifically political. Now, unfortunately, some people make those things political, but pluralism doesn't need to be something that's inherently about a political issue. Like, oh, we need to have different viewpoints about or hear different viewpoints about things. It's just that whole coming together aspect that
Mhm.
you were talking about. So it's not even about viewpoints. It's just, hey, we're all a community here. We need to band together and help lift everybody up. So I think that's great that you took such a wide variety of examples there. But of course, this isn't all about the positive aspects about pluralism. Unfortunately, there's a lot about politics that isn't positive. But I want to go into some of the challenges facing it just to really demonstrate what work still needs to be done. Clearly, there are some people who don't value pluralism, or at least don't place much importance on it. And that's for various reasons. So But for you, why do you think some people don't place proper value on pluralism? And what would you say to these people to demonstrate the value of pluralism?
This is a real challenge. I will say that the work of New Pluralists is explicitly non-political. Like, we really do understand pluralism as being foundational to our ability to live in a democracy, like small d democracy, and navigate the diversity of the people in our society together well, and actually that we're better off for doing so. So that takes shape in all aspects of life, not just political life. But I think one of the challenges to pluralism, well, there are several. One is the a misunderstanding or just like not familiarity with the word, or a limited view of what the word even means, if folks do know. But I think I mentioned earlier this idea that pluralism is often shorthanded for sort of bridge building dialogue work, when it actually encompasses all these other kinds of work that we've been talking about, right? And so I think that's part of why it might be either undervalued or sort of not prioritized, is that it's um, pigeonholed or sort of put into a box, when essentially it's like a way of working to advance really all the issues that we care about towards the more durable solutions, right? By building bigger coalitions, by enrolling like the bigger we on board with the kinds of advancements we want to make in society. Like, we won't necessarily continue to like flip flop back and forth between who's in power, who wins, right? That's like a really tough cycle. It's hard to break out of. I think the other thing, or a challenge to pluralism, is often that it's seen as kind of weak or ineffective or sort of soft. For too soft for addressing the real, quote unquote, real problems or urgent action. And we see this in even talking about democracy work, pro democracy work. What matters now, right? There's this idea you were talking about earlier of like fighting fire with fire. Right? If one group is doing this, then the other group needs to counter it with like a stronger whatever it is. And we really challenge that notion. Number one, that it's a false choice between pluralism and urgent action. Like, those things are not mutually exclusive. We also are, think this is some of the hardest work that we'll ever do. It's not soft work, right? It sits underneath and at the foundation of us being able to make progress on any of the urgent challenges that we face. And so, all that being said, we also know that there's critique of pluralism as like papering over real differences, right? Like, let's just find the common ground and not address where we really do have profound differences. We don't That's not our understanding or our experience of how pluralism works. But I think that's one of the challenges that can make it hard for folks to come to the table, because they feel like they won't there won't be a real attending to power imbalances, or some of the things you were mentioning earlier too, where if groups really feel their identity as being threatened and not upheld in terms of dignity, then like, how are they going to really engage, and how's that going to work? So I think there's a number of challenges that we are up against, and to some extent, doing pluralism work is really asking folks to like go against the grain of the environment that we're in. And that can feel risky, and that requires some fortitude too. And so that's also a challenge. Like, it's not always easy.
Yeah, yeah. Unfortunately, it's not easy. Otherwise, we would have fixed all our issues, right? Uh, so, something you kind of got on was, it's something I've been trying to work more with recently. I actually did an episode of this podcast just by myself about it, but I'm trying to do more with it. This concept of efficient versus deliberative government, and you
Mm.
kind of touched on it there with is pluralism going to, bog down, or we sometimes you need swift action, so we can't account for everybody's viewpoints, which maybe in some ways you can understand, but then is that necessarily is that the way to go in some cases, but not others? And I mean that's it's a bit of a different topic, but it just kind of made me think of that. But obviously, yeah, ideally you do want to have as many different viewpoints as possible, but at some point a decision does need to be made, and sometimes people won't be happy, but you at least hopefully hear everybody out, or at least hear as many different viewpoints as you can. But that kind of goes into this next question I had. So we talk about how some people just don't want pluralism because they, like you said, need to fight fire with fire, or they just want to win and they don't want to give up any ground to anybody. But on the flip side, in the past, a criticism of pluralism that I've heard has been that it's not that we aren't pluralist enough, but that we are so pluralist that there are so many competing groups that it's bogging down the system and leading to gridlock and policy paralysis, or what some people call hyperpluralism. Do you think that there is any merit to those arguments? And whether you do or not, what would you say in response?
Thank you for the question. I mean, yes, I hear that critique or that concern. I mean, I don't think that pluralism is what is bogging us down. I recognize that, challenges like polarization might be if they're, actually unable to hear different sides and actually come together. But I think to your point of trying to build durable solutions to the really intractable some problems that we're facing, pluralism is the way. You know, Rachel Kleinfeld is a political scientist who talks about, there's only sort of a few options for dealing with diversity and difference, and pluralism, is the best for many reasons. But there is a recognition that we in the U.S. now are the most sort of diverse society trying to do this thing. We've been, the American experiment that has always been imperfect from the beginning continues to be imperfect, but is coming up on, 250-year anniversary that, folks are really talking about. And like, it hasn't like been done before in a way. And so I think while there are lots of reasons to be critical of our systems, and we have to look at policy paralysis and gridlock and rethink or reconfigure like how things can work better for people, right? Not starting with dignity and belonging, for all, not sort of leaning into thinking beyond binary solutions, like not embracing those pieces of pluralism, or at least attempting, is not a solution that's going to take us where we want to go. So, right, in democracy, if there's not an effort, as you said, to bring in representative voices as much as possible, then it's not, it really, you start to question the like democratic legitimacy of the decisions that get made, right? And so pluralism is not about slowing everything down or sort of contributing to gridlock. It's really about ensuring decisions have enough buy-in to stick, to work in practice. And we have, research, or we've supported research that I won't quote well off the top of my head, but like when you really survey Americans across all kinds of lines of difference, right? People generally care about and are concerned about similar things, right? Affordability, can they provide for their family, children, safety, education, right? There are healthcare, there are things that matter to people's lives that um, that are sort of consistent. And I say that to say the idea that needing to hear multiple perspectives will somehow slow us down really goes counter to like the core concern. There are core concerns that most folks agree on, and mostly in directionality wise, could get on board with to some extent. Obviously, it's easier said than done. But I think context matters. And the alternative, like non-pluralist alternatives, are worse. Decisions like made without that kind of representative participation could be faster, but come with a whole host of problems and challenges.
And not to mention that it might not truly effectively solve the problem you're trying to solve, and it creates other issues that then take longer to solve, which you might have gotten fixed if you actually took a more
That's
pluralist
right.
route. Um, there was something else that you had said earlier on in that answer, and it escaped my head. That happens a lot. I think of something and then it just floats away immediately.
It'll come
um,
back. Yeah,
yeah, hopefully it will. But yeah, I mean that's at the very least, providing people a voice would go a long way, even if they don't automatically win. At least if or if they don't win a particular argument, at the very least, most people will feel like, okay, at least I was heard out. And you hear that in even if you just talk about relationships in general between
sure.
people, whether it's spouses or friends or anything like that. They at least if they were heard by the other person, even if they're still upset about whatever it is that they're upset about, at the very least they feel like, okay, well, at least they heard me out. As long as you're genuinely trying to hear them out. Sometimes, there could be
Yeah.
that token like, oh yeah, we're yeah, give us your feedback, but they don't really try to incorporate it. Hopefully they actually do try to incorporate that feedback. uh, so I know we just kind of talked about them already, but maybe just make it more concrete, very specific. What do you think are 2 to 3 of the largest threats to pluralism in America today?
Sure. So I think there are three interconnected threats that we talk about at New Pluralists that are central to our work. The first is dehumanization. So we've been talking about this all throughout our conversation, but when groups of people are stripped of their dignity and othered, and seen as less than human with behaviors that follow, it makes it hard to impossible to work across differences, um, by not affording others like basic respect. So that's one. Disconnection would be the second. So this is a breakdown of the relationships, the norms and habits and relationships that really hold people together and connect people together across difference. There's sort of the isolation pieces of this, that crisis of isolation and loneliness and things that we hear about, which makes it harder then to see others' humanity, and find common ground. And then there's also structural segregation and the ways that our lives are just really separate from one another. And I would say within that, we are really attending to um, class divides at New Pluralists as being, when I think about like sort of two Americas that people live in, and where some of the dividing lines are. And I think across socioeconomic status, or just, whether that's a formal indicator or just a sense of like, are people feel like they're thriving in their life? There's like dividing lines there that are really keep us disconnected. And then the third piece, that of the threat is distrust, right? This is the erosion of confidence in others, like goodwill, and like also, of course, institutional distrust, which we see a lot of, but as well like interpersonal suspicion, right? This makes cooperation nearly impossible if we don't trust that the other side has some good faith, willingness to come to the table. It's really, really hard to engage. So when we're talking about cultivating pluralism, we're talking about cultivating a greater sense of belonging, greater sense of social trust in one another and in our institutions, and then a greater sense of cooperation, like willingness to come together to solve problems. And I think the intersection of dehumanization, disconnection, and distrust undermines our ability to do that. Those, I think, are the three biggest threats. And then, given that we're in philanthropy, I'll add that this work is also deeply underfunded, sort of across philanthropy, but also like where um, where we would see this work at scale, the infrastructure that's required to really hold communities together, all of that needs attending to as well.
Yeah. Actually, the point about distrust actually reminded me of something I was going to say a little bit ago. You talked about needing to obviously trusting other people, but you need to trust our political institutions. Yes, you can critique things, and you should. And I actually talked a little bit about that in my episode last week. But you, nothing is above criticism, but whether it's people or institutions. But if you don't come at it from a good faith perspective, if you don't at least trust in the fact that these people are here to they want the same things you do, or if you're talking about institutions, that it's here to make the country better, but we can still critique these things. But if you're distrustful of them, that is going to just further erode our civic culture. And it's a very important part that you bring up there. And then on the disconnection part, that is something I think at least is getting talked more about.
Mhm.
You talk about these we see a lot of these stories about people being radicalized, whether it's for terrorism or for some other sort of extreme ideology. How many times have we heard the person who was capable of that violence was disconnected from everybody else? And it's
That's right.
sometimes we do this to ourselves, where we segment ourselves and isolate ourselves. But then of course you have the problem with social media algorithms also doing it, and the fragmentation of media in general, where there is a whatever it is you believe in, there's a very specific channel for you. Whereas like back in maybe 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago, even 60 years ago, you had relatively few channels, but more people from varying political views had to go to those channels. Now you can find anything to cater to what you
That's right.
want. And as long as if we can be more cognizant of it, it'll really go a long way to fighting back against this disconnected feeling that a lot of us have. And a lot of times in politics, there needs to be incentives for people to act upon something. So do you think we need to find a way to incentivize pluralism so that more people buy into it? Or is it simply a matter of education? Or is it something else, or some combination of the above?
Yes, I love this question. I don't have the answer, but I do think it's a combination. I think I spend a lot of time thinking about incentive structure. I think that some of it is education, and some of it is like getting back to things that we've always known about being human and what connects us, and how to do that. Even as like we need to recreate or create new opportunities and things like that. But I mean, I'm very concerned about the algorithm, for example, and the incentive structure that it really incentivizes like contempt. And so that's totally counter to what we're talking about. And so how exactly that can feel really overwhelming and then sort of disempowering. So I think about it, or we think about it on sort of the daily practice, daily interactions, like the really human side of life. And also that incentives would need to be about like how we act it's sort of experiential. Like we can't like think our way out of these things. We can talk more about that. And that's, I think, the combination of what you're saying in terms of education. I think education is super important. I also think how people learn is, there's formal education structures, yes, and then there's culture. And, New Pluralist is entirely focused on culture change, not sort of policy, as we said, not in that realm, but what takes shape in culture, the norms and habits and ways of being together that we want to promote, like our forms of education. Like, how do we bring people in and bring people along and sort of show how pluralistic ways of being are enriching and sort of can support people to improving lives. Like that's, I think, the challenge that we are facing when it comes to how to incentivize this, when sort of lots of forces are incentivizing the opposite.
Yeah, and of course, I strongly am a strong proponent of the civic education aspect, but it is also a good idea to not necessarily totally separate, but to supplement alongside it the changing of the culture. Because
Mhm.
even if you provide people an education, and I've talked about this with a previous guest of mine, some people just, even if you teach them it, they're like, okay, but why should I care?
Right.
And in some ways, having having it through fixing the culture is actually what's going to teach them to care. Obviously, some reforming of how we teach civics can go a long way, but in some ways, the culture is really what needs to change for people to realize, oh, okay, I see why pluralism is so important. This is why pluralism helps to fix our communities, is how we find these solutions.
Yes.
So definitely a good, not necessarily dichotomy, but side by side kind of deal there. So obviously, we've talked a lot about the practical, actionable information about pluralism, and I especially like to end or come towards the end of podcast episodes with more practical tips. So, what are 2 to 3 practical ways that we as individuals can uphold and promote pluralism in our communities?
Oh, I love this. Okay. First practical tip. We talked about this at the very beginning, but do the work to identify your own blind spots first. Where do you exist in an echo chamber? Sorry, an echo chamber. That awareness, I think, is both like really practical and grounded, and then can lead to the next sort of steps or practical things that I might suggest. So the next one might be like do things across difference, like don't, just think about wanting to be pluralistic, but like where can you connect with folks who you might not otherwise normally connect with? And again, this doesn't have to be across political lines, but there's so many examples in communities of like community suppers where, that are meant to just help people know each other better, or, neighborhood block parties. I think somebody was telling me last night about like this block party tree lighting you know, sort of thing that was happening in a neighborhood, not far from me. I thought, right, like you could go show up somewhere different that you'll find people that you haven't connected with. There's also like lots of collaborative problem solving opportunities on very local issues, like sort of happening all over. That's a little bit of investigative work to find where those things are happening in your community and show up. Doesn't mean you have to take it all on, but like see what that's like to be in a space that's different than where you typically spend your time and the people you typically spend time with. um I think there's also similarly opportunities, or find an opportunity to just put yourself in a space where meaningful connection can happen. So we have another, a grantee called Warm Cookies of the Revolution, right? And they use like really creative public events that invite people in to share stories, build trust, sort of co-create futures. It's like fun too, and that goes to the point that I was making earlier. Like some of this is hard, it's not always easy, and that is disincentivizing, right? If you like know something's going to be hard, it kind of makes it hard to show up. But there are plenty of spaces, or there could be if you seek them out, um, that are meant for just building connection and are sort of low stakes in terms of like what the outcome needs to be. So I think practicing those kinds of things in our daily lives are ways to be pluralistic. And then the last one I would say really practically is to uphold dignity in our own everyday interactions. So again, some of the dehumanization that we're seeing, um, it seeps in even when we don't intend it to. Like we're good people, we have right intentions, we, learn the golden rule, or we think we treat people well. Like just that extra intention to treat others that we encounter with curiosity, with care, like not assuming things about people we interact with, just like disagreeing non-violently or not escalating, like just that mindfulness, which I know, can feel like a big word to bring in here, but really like making the commitment to uphold dignity in our own interactions, to me feels both practical and super important.
The dignity part and interpersonal interactions and the echo chambers part, it's something I try to stress to other people, or and also to myself, is when we talk about something like the freedom of speech in general. It's not just about, if we really believe in the freedom of speech and other people's dignity, it's not just about government's actions, it's about what we also do. If we really want people to be free to express their opinions, to be able to put forth their ideas, we need to actually practice being okay with those in our individual lives too. And unfortunately, those echo chambers they're very tempting and they're very easy to fall into. And it does take a lot of work to break yourself out of it and to recognize when you're falling into those echo chambers. So definitely good to stress those points, and especially with the, upholding dignity in each other's lives, which is also, it's a lot harder to be vicious to people in real life as opposed to being on the computer and getting into, like we said earlier, dumb Facebook arguments, or
That's right.
or Twitter. I mean, I guess is even worse. But yeah, I think that's another thing, is just having more interpersonal interactions. With so much interaction being online now, it's that also, I think, contributes a lot to
Good point.
dehumanizing everybody. So before I get to the random question of the day, any final thoughts that you'd like to leave us with about pluralism or the work of new pluralists in general?
Well, I really appreciate this conversation. And I think a reminder for me, as much as for anyone as a sort of a final word who's watching or listening, is that pluralism isn't something you can just like study or advocate from afar, right? It really is about this daily practice or daily choices to connect, to affirm people's dignity. Like it's something that you experience in your lived life. Yes, that can be online as well as sort of in the real world. But we can't think our way to um, more pluralism. And it's meant to be lived and experienced. And I think it taps into the things that make us human. And therefore, because we are all human, we can all be pluralists.
I think that's a great final point. Yeah, it is. I th- that's another thing too, is just in general with politics, there's a lot of apathy or not wanting to get involved, which I can understand and respect to some extent, because politics can get very nasty and
Sure.
very just, I don't want to deal with this. But you don't have to get into the mud to promote pluralism. In fact, it's the
That's right.
exact opposite, and we do need more people to truly support that, regardless of whatever party or ideology is in question here. So that is going to end the pluralism part of our conversation. Now let's get into the random question of the day. So
Okay.
I like to, for those who are new, I like to end guest interviews with a random question of the day. It's fun, it's non-political, uh, might be simple, might be wacky. Who knows? Well, I do, because I'm about to ask it. But today's random question of the day for you, Liz, is: should Pluto be upgraded back to full planet status?
Wow. Okay. This is easy because I claim very little mastery or knowledge about our planetary world. But what I will say is, as someone who believes in a bigger we, I don't like the idea that Pluto has been downgraded or demoted to somehow like lesser than a planet. I learned about Pluto as a planet, and so with no scientific, this is like a totally non-scientific answer. But like, yeah, I want Pluto in the like planetary world. I want Pluto in our bigger way. So I'm full yes for no evidence or scientific reason.
True to your pluralist roots.
That's right.
We can't exclude Pluto. So
That's right.
not quite. I agree, but not quite for the same reason.
Tell me
Yeah, I
why.
mean, yeah, that's. I mean, you had to change so many textbooks, and I remember I was a huge astronomy nerd when I was
Okay.
a kid. I just love all things space. Obviously, can't devote as much time to it as I used to as a kid, but I love space. Uh, but the reason why I think Pluto, I mean, just besides the fact that why did we bother
Yeah.
wasting our time changing this? is find the main guy who led the charge to demote it, Neil deGrasse Tyson, which I think is funny. Like, he's so beloved, but yet people were so pissed when Pluto got demoted from full planet status. But I personally can't stand Neil deGrasse Tyson. I think he's kind of pretentious and obnoxious. So just to spite him, I think Pluto should be back to planet status. Very, very petty, very not pluralist of me. But
Not pluralist, also not scientific. So just to
yeah,
say, as an astronomer, I wasn't expecting that answer. I'll say that much.
yeah. So yeah, no, I fully recognize the pettiness of it, and yeah, but I do
Question.
like Pluto just because it's so
I do
isolated out
too.
there and it feels lonely.
Yeah,
But
I agree.
but but maybe one day, Pluto, hopefully one day you'll get back to your rightful place. But that's going to end today's episode. As of course, thank you so much, Liz, for coming on. Before we go, though, any other links that you want to share? Obviously, I'll share New Pluralists website, but is there anything else you want to put up?
That's great. Thank you so much for having me, Paul. Thanks for the conversation.
All right. Yep, that'll do it. So my links, my Facebook, my Paul Rader author and speaker, my LinkedIn profile, my medium.com profile I write on from time to time, my website, paulrader.org, paulraderwrites@gmail.com if you want to email me, and my 5-day educational email course about how we can all better mitigate polarization. I think it's very relevant to today's topic. So that is going to wrap things up for us. So thank you so much for listening, and we'll see you next time.